The theme of the second edition of the Conclave is Breaking Through, Making India a Creative Superpower, which aims to explore the country's preparedness for the age of knowledge economy and identify ways to harness the intellectual and institutional resources to make India a global superpower. We are privileged, ladies and gentlemen, to have a most distinguished lineup of speakers, dignitaries, and a very eminent audience. We will be starting the program shortly, and may I request everyone to please put their mobile phones on silent mode to avoid distraction to our speakers and to the audience alike. We would also like to inform you that we will be conducting a live poll during the sessions. Please download the AIMA app to participate in the live polling during NLC. Gentlemen, may I remind you that we are conducting a poll during the sessions, which is a live poll. We request you to download the AIMA mobile app to participate in the live polling during NLC. The user ID is NLC and the password is AIMA. We would also request you to please fill up question slips during the sessions and please pass them on to the nearest volunteer. If you have any questions on the respective sessions, may I once again request you all to please do note them down on the question slips. The question slips were already a part of your delegate kit, and please pass them on to the nearest volunteer. We shall be starting the proceedings this morning with Pax Indica, Shaping a New World Order. This is going to be our first session of day 2. And as you all know that this session is all set to be graced by Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Honorable Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha, and Chairman, Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. We are expecting Mr. Tharoor to join us shortly. Meanwhile, please bear with us as we are awaiting the arrival of the Honorable Dignitary. Thank you, and I wish you a very pleasant day ahead of deliberations and some very interesting and informative sessions. Stage, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha, and Chairman, Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. And joining us on stage is Mr. Firdaus Bandrawala, President, All India Management Association. And ladies and gentlemen, the poll question for this session is, India's place in the New World Order will be determined only by the strength of its economy. Yes, no, maybe. We'll request you to please log on to the AIMA app or website and participate. May I now request Mr. Firdaus Bandrawala to please deliver the welcome address and initiate the session.
Good morning, everybody. Well, the address is very simple. It's the La Meridian Hotel, New Delhi. Anyway, it's my privilege to welcome you all at this special session on India's role in emerging world order with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor, it's a pleasure to have you with us at the Conclave, and thank you for agreeing to do this session. And nothing like a great start, so it's a pleasure to have you with us. A very warm welcome to you. The theme of the session is phrased on the lines of a book that you had authored a few years ago. In that book, you had storied the evolution of India's foreign policy through different eras, and you had advised India to play an active role in the world in the 21st century. That was a time when India was being hyped to be the next superpower, and the world was being told to get ready for it. Another UPA minister had written a book claiming the 21st century as India's century. However, since then, the sentiments have bounced about like a yo-yo, from excitement to exasperation, to delirium, and sometimes to doubt. Therefore, it is important for us to define India's global ambition clearly and to forecast its role in the new world with reasonable accuracy. Historically, India has been an inward-looking country, and foreign affairs do not matter much to most Indians. India has not felt the need for global influence to promote its interests beyond domestic security and economy. Also, India has not invested enough in foreign policy institutions. Therefore, India's role and place in the world order has been largely defined by others depending on their self-interests, whether commercial or geopolitical. As India's economic growth has revived, it is backed as the next economic superpower. As China begins to throw its weight around, India is being asked to play the role of a counterweight in Asia. While it is nice to be valued by others, India has to lead the world in its own self-interest and on terms that promote its commerce and security. Credibility. The Prime Minister has made a big effort during the past couple of years to market India to the world and to make strategic friends. He has pulled off diplomatic coups of sorts by having presidents of the USA and France as visiting dignitaries during the Republic Day celebrations. However, any relationship building has to have well-defined long-term national interests and to have sustained gains from international relations. The institutions of foreign policy have to be strengthened. Having said that, as Dr. Tharoor is the expert on the subject, I would rather leave it to him to outline how India can shape the new world order and to have an eminent place in it. While he needs no introduction, let me briefly say a few words about him. A diplomat with 3 decades of experience at the United Nations, he has participated in global affairs at the highest level. He was the Under-Secretary General of the UN when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General. A 2-time member of the Lok Sabha, he has served as Minister of State for External Affairs and Minister of State for Human Resource Development in the UPA II government. Currently, he is the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. A prolific author, he has written 15 books in different genres, including fiction and politics. A much sought-after commentator on politics and international affairs, he writes columns and articles for leading publications. It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Tharoor to address the conclave on the theme Pax Indica, Shaping the New World Order.
Thank you very much, Feroz Vandriwala. Good morning to everyone. I must say I was very touched and impressed by the comprehensive introduction we just heard. One small thing, it's only a part of the theme of my book, Pax Indica, that I will address. So if you really want to see what I think about India's place in the world as a whole, I will have to encourage you to read the entire book. But I am very, very pleased that all of you leaders in business, government, and academia are willing to get up early in the morning and come here to think about the future world order and India's place in it. So I'd like to offer my compliments to the organizers for encouraging dialogue and discussion on such a subject here. Now, as Feroz Vandriwala pointed out, much of the conventional analyses of India's stature in the world tend to rely on the all-too-familiar economic assumptions. But we are famously a land of paradoxes, and amongst those paradoxes is that so many speak about India as a great power of the 21st century when we're not yet able to feed, educate, and employ all our people. There's an irony to us, or some of us, aspiring to be a superpower when, as I pointed out some years ago, we are still super poor. Now, the Prime Minister, as he mentioned, is a tireless salesman abroad for the Indian economy, but a salesman can only be as good as the product that he is selling. And I'm afraid that so far the PM appears to be marketing an empty package. I will defend that during the Q&A if you wish, but it's not just, in other words, economic growth that I want to focus on this morning, or for that matter, military strength, or even population numbers. You really want one number where we're going to top the charts. By 2026, we're going to overtake China to become the most populous country in the world. So we'll be a population superpower, but in any other number, I'm not quite sure we're going to be number one. Rather, what I'd like to talk about in the evolution of Pax Indica, and then I'll come back to what I mean by Pax Indica at the end, is a quality that we've already been displaying in ample measure for some years, and that is India's soft power. We cannot be, perhaps, in my view, a conventional superpower, but we can be, as the theme of your conference suggests, a creative superpower. Now, the notion of soft power is relatively new in international discourse. It was coined by a friend of mine, Joseph Nye of Harvard, to describe the extraordinary strengths of the US that went beyond its own military dominance. In fact, very simply, what is power? Power is the ability to get other people to do what you want, very simply. And there are essentially three ways of doing this, and Nye puts it very well. He says there's sticks, in other words, military enforcement. There's carrots, in other words, inducement, money, bribes, if you like, development aid, if you like. And there is one more, and that is the power of attraction. Basically, if you have the power of attraction, you can economize on the sticks and the carrots. Now, this is a very interesting idea, and it comes out of the fact that by the late 20th century, the conventional idea that the side with the bigger army always wins is basically going out the window. As you know, the US, the world's only superpower, certainly at that point the largest and most powerful of the two superpowers, lost the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union, the other superpower, got kicked out of Afghanistan by a motley crew of mujahideen. And even in the beginning of the 21st century, when the Americans took over Iraq, the conventional war went very easily, but then they discovered, and during the occupation, the wisdom of the French statesman Talleyrand's famous remark that the one thing you cannot do with a bayonet is sit on it. So the occupation could not be conducted by power either. So in other words, basically, power has limitations, and you need something more. I would go slightly beyond Joseph Nye. I think your soft power, which is the phrase he used to describe this power of attraction, your soft power comes from all the associations conjured up by the very name of your country in the minds of foreigners when they think about you. The mere mention of a country's name carries with it certain associations, and that may be more useful than the more clinical academic analysis of Joseph Nye, where he says soft power emerges from three things: its culture in places where it's attractive to others, its political values where it lives up to them at home and abroad, and its foreign policies when they are legitimate and seen as having moral authority. That's a quote from Nye. I think that's very well, but I would go beyond it and speak about the almost instinctive associations that such a thing would have, the very mention of a name would have in people's minds. So when I speak about India in the world, I feel that our intangible standing emerges from the products of Indian society and culture that the world might find attractive. Now, the roots of our soft power run very deep throughout our history. We are a civilization that over millennia offered refuge and, more importantly, religious and cultural freedom to people of all sorts of backgrounds from around the region. Jews, we had the world's oldest Jewish diaspora. According to oral legend in Kerala, they came when the Babylonians destroyed their temple. But certainly there's evidence of their having come when the Romans destroyed their second temple, if not earlier. And there is a further legend that when the Christian apostle, St. Thomas, doubting Thomas of the Bible, landed on the shores of Kerala, that he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. And one of the most amazing things is this is the only instance in world history of a Jewish diaspora that never knew a single instance of persecution or anti-Semitism, which is not true of any other Jewish diaspora in the more than 70 or 80 countries where they fled during the great dispersal of the Jewish people. The only country where they were never persecuted was India, until, of course, the Portuguese showed up in the 16th century to do it. The Parsis came to Gujarat. There's a wonderful story of these ships showing up off the coast. They were fleeing persecution in Persia by the Muslims, and they show up in in Gujarat, and of course the king is very alarmed by this sort of foreign invasion, so he sends an envoy to tell them there's no room for them. But they have no language in common, so in order to communicate the idea, the king's envoy takes a glass of water and drops a stone in it, and the water overflows, and he signals to the Parsi ship captain that this means that there's not enough room because if the Parsis come, the people will overflow the land. Whereupon the captain apparently stops the envoy and says, wait a minute, he calls for a glass of milk, and he carefully stirs a spoonful of sugar into it, to convey that the Parsi presence would not, in fact, destabilize or result in an overflow. It would merely add sweetness to the existing mixture. And this story so impressed the king that he invited the Parsis to remain, and that's why to this day, the mother tongue of Parsis in India is Gujarati. Now, there are stories that I can tell you, hundreds of stories like this. Islam came to my state of Kerala and to South India generally very peacefully. Came in the lifetime of the Prophet. For centuries there have been traders going across the Arabian Sea. They came, traders, missionaries, merchants. The local kings allowed them to practice their faith in peace. In fact, the oldest mosque outside the Arabian Peninsula is one in Kodungalur, just near Kochi, about less than 100 kilometers from Kochi. And you can go and see how this was clearly an earlier piece of worship. It's dominated by a gigantic Kerala lamp, which is not something you associate normally with Islam. And at one point, the Zamorin of Calicut, the ruler of Calicut, actually issued a decree obliging every fisherman in his family to bring up one child as a Muslim. Why? He was a Hindu king, but he was so impressed by the seafaring skills of the Muslim sailors off his coast, the Kunjali Marikas and so on, that he decided that only Muslims could sail properly, so he wanted an all-Muslim navy, and he had one, this Hindu king, for many decades. So this is the kind of thing. I mean, I grew up in Calcutta, and I still remember the India where the wail of the Muslim muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer used to literally blend with the tinkling of bells at the Shiva Mandir right in the corner. And that in turn was competing with the loudspeakers outside the Sikh Gurudwara reciting verses from the Granth Sahib, and then round the corner was St. Paul's Cathedral. I mean, that was always India. And it's interesting that a few decades ago, the British historian E.P. Thompson wrote that India is the most important country for the future of the world. And he explained why. He said, all the convergent influences of this world run through this society. There is not a thought that is being taught in the East or the West that is not active in some Indian mind, quote unquote. I'm glad a Brit said that and not an Indian. But this is where the roots of Indian culture go. And then you've got the modern manifestations of it, building upon this long tradition of eclecticism, diversity, tolerance. You've got everything from the past to the present to the immediate future. What do I mean? Well, take perhaps the most visible and successful commercially embodiment of Indian culture around the world is Bollywood, right? I mean, in many ways, a non-Bollywood film confirmed that, the triumph of Slumdog Millionaire at the 2009 Oscars. But it's not just that. I mean, I've met African leaders, prime ministers and presidents who've told me almost misty-eyed about how much seeing a Bollywood movie in their childhood meant to them. In fact, a Senegalese friend in New York recounted how his mother, his illiterate mother, takes a bus once a month from her village to the capital city of Dakar just to watch a Bollywood movie. Of course, she can't understand the dialogues or the lyrics. She's illiterate, so she can't read the French subtitles, but our Bollywood movies are made to be understood despite such handicaps. And she has a great time watching the song and dance in action, and she goes away with stars in her eyes about India as a result. Now, Indian art, classical music, dance, all of these also spreading. The work of Indian fashion designers. Now, every Oscar is not complete, as we saw even this week, without some dress made by an Indian designer. Indian cuisine spreading around the world. I mean, the French have always known that the way to foreigners' hearts is through their palates. But in India's case, we're seeing this now widespread. There isn't a small or medium-sized town anywhere left in the Western world that doesn't have an Indian restaurant or several. And in Britain today, the so-called Indian curry houses, as they call them, the restaurants, have proliferated to such a point that they employ more people in England than the iron and steel, coal mining, and shipbuilding industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Now, this kind of thing, very frankly, is part of the modern projection of a view of India. Everything from Bollywood to Bhangra dancers have now captured the Western imagination. But as I said, it's also the appeal of some of our traditional practices. Yoga has proliferated. Again, you won't find a small town in America without a yoga class on offer. And one point I've always been willing to concede to the present government has been the adoption by the United Nations of the International Day of Yoga, which of course has made that one day every year people around the world are practicing something which they then associate with India, and that adds to India's stature and prestige. But it's not just the ancient past. Of course, I should add Ayurveda to that, because Ayurveda continues to be a huge calling card, not just tourists coming to Kerala, but when I was in Colombia, for example, in Bogota, the then President Uribe, and I was there on an official visit as minister, he said to me that one of the things that his country really needed was Ayurvedic clinics, because he was so impressed by the ancient science of wellness that India had to offer. So we've got all of these examples, but we can also think about the future. Information technology in the last 20 years has become a huge calling card for India. Y2K, of course, is what made it so. But since then, the takeoff has been amazing, and Americans in Silicon Valley now refer to the IITs with the same reverence they used to afford only to MIT. And the result now is that the Indianness of an engineer or a software developer is immediately assumed to be synonymous with scientific, mathematical, engineering excellence. This has now become the respect with which Indians are greeted in the Western world. Such a transformation from the time that I went abroad to study in 1975, when the conventional image was still of India as a poor country with a begging bowl, naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, Indian snake charmers doing the rope trick. This was the kind of image. Or at best, if you wanted one positive image, it would have been a Maharaja sitting on a caparisoned elephant. There would never have been the sense of India as a modern, scientifically advanced country. This change has been so dramatic that quite recently a friend of mine told me that he was accosted at an airport in Europe by an anxiously perspiring white man saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? So that old image has now been replaced by an image where every Indian must be a software geek or a computer engineer. And this friend of mine had, like me, studied history or something. Now, all of this is part of who we are in the world. And, the Tata Nano might have been, I know that for those who used to work in Tatas, might be a marketing disaster in India, but globally, the respect it's won in engineering is quite amazing. It took the Geneva Auto Salon by storm. It was seen as an absolute marvel of no-frills engineering, stripping off all the inessentials and creating such an inexpensive car that still met European emission standards. But if that's not enough, Tata's acquisition of Jaguar and Land Rover made possible last summer that wonderful joke that went around the internet when the British Prime Minister David Cameron won re-election and was going off to Buckingham Palace to reclaim his mandate. And he was going, as the internet jokes pointed out, in an Indian car, a Jaguar, escorted by another Indian car, a Land Rover. Fair enough. I mean, obviously, we all know where that came from, but it shows where India has come. And Joseph has always made the point that, no longer the land of the bigger army, but the land of the better story that prevails in the 21st century. Because in the 21st century, hard power, ask the Russians, ask the Chinese, carries with it the odium of mass public disapproval. Whereas soft power is what everyone likes, everyone talks about, everyone wants to circulate on their WhatsApp or their internet forwards or their emails. And this soft power is where we score. We haven't done so well in hard power. I can discuss that in the Q&A if you want, but we score very much in soft power. And as a society, with a free press and a thriving, if somewhat irresponsible mass media, with a people whose creative energies, going back to the creative superpower theme, are daily encouraged to express themselves in a variety of different ways, appealing ways, India has an extraordinary ability to tell stories that are more persuasive and attractive to the world than those of its rivals. This is not about propaganda. I always believe that Propaganda never works very well, and anything that's directed from above, especially by the government, is less effective than anything that comes naturally from the bottom. But its impact can be huge. One example I was always very fond of giving when I started talking about soft power a few years ago was the example of Afghanistan, such a major security and foreign policy and geopolitical priority for us. But in fact, we never had any military assets in Afghanistan. We still don't. What was our biggest asset for about 7, 8 years was the fact that you couldn't, until about 3 years ago when this stopped, you actually couldn't call an Afghan at 8:30 in the evening. Why? Because that was the time when Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi was screened on Afghan television, Tolo TV, dubbed in Dari. And what was striking was something like 92% of all the TV sets in Afghanistan were tuned to this one show. It was so popular that mullahs started complaining that people were missing religious events in order to watch the show. There were tales of weddings being interrupted so that people could watch, cluster around the TV for half an hour and then pay their attention to the bride and groom. It was extraordinary. Crime went up at 8:30 in the evening because even the darwans or chowkidars were busy watching TV. There was a famous story reported by the British news agency Reuters, so not by an Indian agency, about how one night at 8:30 in Mazar-e-Sharif, robbers stripped a car of every single detachable part, almost like the engineers of the Tata Nano. They took out the side view mirrors, the windshield wipers, the hubcaps, the spokes, the extra rims, everything. And then they scrawled in chalk on the windshield, in an allusion to the show's heroine, Tulsi Zindabad. Now, you know, the Indian taxpayer never had to pay for this, and this is why I wish that Tulsi had stayed on television instead of ruining our education system. Anyway, so this is the strength. This is the strength of our growing soft power. Now, the fact is that I'm not arguing that it's more important than hard power, merely that it's different and it's our strength. Hard power's limitations, as I said, are apparent. Soft power lasts longer, has a wider and more self-reinforcing reach. But let's face it, an Islamist terrorist who enjoys a Bollywood movie, as most Pakistanis do, will still have no compunction about putting a bomb in the movie theater in Delhi where he saw it. The US already learned that the perpetrators of 9/11 had their last meal at a McDonald's. So don't assume that soft power is going to protect you by itself. There is no counter to terrorism but hard power. Hard power without soft power, however, stirs up resentments and enmities. Equally, soft power without hard power is just a confession of weakness. There must be a marriage of the two for effective policy and for true global influence. But where soft power can work in global security terms is in attracting enough goodwill from ordinary people to reduce the sources of support and succor that our enemies, especially the terrorists, enjoy, and without which they cannot function. But this means that India must also solve its internal problems before it can play a meaningful role of leadership in the world. We have to ensure that we keep our own people healthy, well-fed, and secure. Secure not just from jihadi terrorism, but also from the daily terror of poverty, hunger, and ill health. Now, progress is being made, we know that, but at the same time, we know that it hasn't reached yet all the population of our country. In fact, I have often said that it doesn't matter in the end if we grow at 6% or 9%. What matters is the 25% at the bottom of our society in whose name all this growth and development is being conducted. So the benefits of these revolutions have to reach the third of our population, or slightly less, that now live below the poverty line. If you don't want your power, your influence in the world to ring hollow. And to do that, therefore, we must also preserve the pluralism of India that the rest of the world finds so attractive. I gave you those anecdotes about the roots of our soft power. I praised our democracy and our media and our thriving human rights groups and NGOs and all of that, as well as, of course, our remarkable democracy, the general elections, our rights of free speech, all of these things, the fact that we have a public discourse that is lively, that is irreverent, that respects no holy cows, all of this gives us a standing in the world that the rest of the world admires and respects, especially those societies that don't have all of this. But every time there are reports of sectarian violence in India, bashing of minorities, a pogrom like 2002 in Gujarat, the tragic lynching of people of a minority community for stupid reasons like what he allegedly had in his fridge, all of this stuff, then India suffers a huge setback to its soft power. When women are assaulted in the streets of our capital, the image of India goes, there was a horrifying story the year after the Nirbhaya tragedy, when a PhD student in India was rejected by a female German supervisor on the grounds that she doesn't want any Indian males because they don't know how to respect women. And this is in the sciences. This is a scientist professor who did this. So we cannot develop and maintain and promote soft power on the basis of a narrow or restricted vision of Indianness. Because once you have confined your idea of what India is to the sectarian, bigoted, narrow-minded views of a few self-appointed guardians of Indian culture, the warriors of Bharatiya Sanskriti, who ignore the multi-religious identities of our people, our linguistic diversity, our rich and complex history and geography, the myriad manifestations of our creative energies. If the people who claim that they're speaking for an authentic India overlook all these examples of our authenticity, they are seriously undermining our soft power and our true heritage in the eyes of the world. As I said, I know controversially once, but it's important to repeat it. If India is reduced in some people's eyes to a land where it's safer to be a cow than a Muslim, then India will suffer in the eyes of the world. Now, our civilizational ethos, as I've said, is a major asset to our country. The goodwill that we have enjoyed and seek to maintain amongst Africans, amongst Arabs, amongst Westerners, amongst Afghans, this has largely been an unplanned byproduct of the normal emanations of Indian culture. None of the things I was talking about were created with foreigners in mind. They were Indians being themselves, creating these things for Indian consumption. But in the process, the world says, gosh, what an attractive country India is. You can't have a situation where you just put on a show because that people will see it. In any case, in the information era, the BJP has never realized that stupid comments made in Agra or in Dadri or God knows which other place also play out in Frankfurt and in New York and in Boston and in London because the media today is global. And there are no compartments you can draw. Your bigotry here echoes against you there. That's something that this government has sadly failed to understand, the damage that's being done. Ironically, China tried to promote soft power through the Beijing Olympics of 2008, that wonderful opening ceremony showcasing Chinese culture, 4,000 years of Chinese civilization and so on. What happened? The media who came to Beijing in large numbers for the Olympics started writing about lack of freedom of speech, lack of democracy in China. So what do the Chinese do? They said, okay, we will now designate 6 places outside Beijing or in and around Beijing where anybody can say anything. They can stand up and declaim against the government if they want to. And this got them very good press for a day or two. But then the police announced that to use those places and speak, you needed a license from the police first. And every single person, I'm not joking, who applied for a license was immediately arrested. So there was not one person who actually spoke in any of those places. This, of course, got reported, and there went the hope of the soft power of Beijing. I certainly hope and pray that India, even under this government, never makes that mistake. Now, I want to go briefly on to this idea of Pax Indica, because one of the things that I've stressed about India is when I talk about this diversity in our soft power, there's also, if you like, a multiplicity or an embracing of paradox in our global geopolitics as well. What I have suggested in Pax Indica is that in the second decade of the 21st century, we've been moving more and more beyond non-alignment to what I perhaps rashly dubbed multi-alignment. I have to admit the phrase never caught on, which is that we maintain a series of relationships in different configurations, some overlapping, some not. My metaphor is really that of the World Wide Web, the internet of today, where on the internet, on the World Wide Web, we're all connected to everybody, either directly or indirectly. We all have different networks. Some of them have the same members as other networks, or partially the same members. Some have totally different members. We're all in these various configurations, and all of these things happen. I'll give you 2 examples of what I mean by this. So every year, our foreign minister meets with her Russian and Chinese counterparts in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans in something called BRICS. Then she takes out the Russians and the Chinese, and she meets with the other two in IBSA for South-South cooperation. And then to IBSA, she adds the Chinese, but not the Russians, in something called BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that belongs to all of these groupings, not merely because our name begins with that most useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because we have something to contribute to each of these groups and something to gain from each of these groups in our geopolitical ambitions. Similarly, we are leading members of the UN. We want a permanent seat on the Security Council, but simultaneously we're also focused on our immediate neighborhood, the 7 neighbors of SAARC. Or we are a leading light of the G77, the global trade union of developing countries. But we are also a leading member of the G20, the global management of the world macroeconomy. Or we continue making strong speeches against the West and the non-aligned movement, a reflection of our colonial heritage. But equally, we are a prominent member of the community of democracies alongside the very Western countries whose imperialism we're attacking in the non-aligned movement. So these seem to be contradictions, but to me they're not. They're an example of this multi-alignment that I talk about, where we are making a contribution to all of these forums, we have something to gain from all of these forums, and we pursue our place in the world in this very creative and increasingly prominent role in the post-superpower age. Because since the days of the Cold War, when two hegemonic behemoths developed the capacity to destroy the world several times over and flex their muscles against each other, including by changing regimes in different parts of the world, fighting wars half a world away, I think those days are truly behind us. We're not going to see that happening again. Some think that China is simply going to supplant the Russians and we're going to have two superpowers. I don't believe that. I think we are witnessing a world of many rising and some risen powers. China clearly is risen, of various sizes and strengths, but each with some significant capacity in its own region, each strong enough not to be pushed around by a hegemon, but not strong enough, in my view, to become a hegemon itself. So they coexist, they cooperate with each other in a series of network relationships. There are all these different strategic relationships that overlap. There are no fixed binaries like the alliances of the Cold War. And so we have this kind of networked world that I've talked about, in which countries realize that the new network world has room for every nation, no room for domination by any one superpower. Relationships are contingent and overlap with others. Friends and allies in one cause might be irrelevant to another, or even on opposite sides in a different cause, doesn't matter. The network world is a more fluid place. Countries use such networks to promote their common interests, to manage common issues rather than impose outcomes, and provide a common response to the challenges and opportunities they face. Some networks will be principally economic in their orientation, some geopolitical, some issue-specific. In such a world, India's multi-alignment, backed by its soft power, serves a variety of purposes. It helps India recast some assumptions and norms on global governance. We've been a rule taker in the global system for far too long. We're now ready to be a rule maker too. That is, we are a state capable of playing a global agenda-setting role. We have the strength, the resources, the economy, the human resource capacity to play an influential role in all these issues, from cybersecurity to from cyberspace to outer space. And all of this gives us the role that I think justifies India's non-alignment. In addition to the various global issues, there are also unconventional threats to the peace. There's terrorism, of course, but there are also pandemics, disease. There's the need to preserve the global commons, keeping open the sea lanes of communication across international waters, for example, so that trade routes and energy supplies are safeguarded, ensuring maritime security from the Horn of Africa to the Straits of Malacca, which obviously affects all the goods coming to us, protecting cyberspace, as I mentioned. All of this, and indeed outer space, can become a new theater for global competition. So there's a lot that we can do. And as an increasingly, not a superpower, a phrase I don't accept, but as a major power, India can and must play a role in helping shape the global order. The international system of the 21st century has to renegotiate the rules of the road, and India is ready, I think, to help rewrite those rules and define the norms that will guide tomorrow's world. So it is, in my view, within India's interests and within India's current and future capacity to take the initiative to shape the evolution of these norms, as well as to have a voice on the situations in which they're applied. This is what I've called Pax Indica. A Pax for the 21st century, a peace system or a peaceful system which will help promote and maintain a period of cooperative coexistence in our region and across the world. This Pax Indica must be built and sustained on the principles and norms that India holds dear at home and abroad. Democracy and pluralism, which I've spent so much of this morning talking about. A world order that defends democracy and pluralism is therefore in our interest. A multi-lined India serving these functions in a network globe in which different nations pursue different interests and global configurations. An India free of poverty, growing and engaging in trade and investment in and with the rest of the world, and upholding arrangements that make such trade and investment possible. An increasingly prosperous India, prepared to share the benefits of its prosperity with other nations and lands on its periphery and its extended neighborhood, land and maritime. We're already giving important aid to Afghanistan, to Bhutan, to Sri Lanka, increasingly to countries of East Africa. This is all part of our own neighborhood. It's part of our promoting our own security in the world. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a technologically savvy India with the skilled human resources available in fields ranging from IT to biotech, satellite technology, software development, lending its expertise to the outside world. So in this sense, Pax Indica would not even just be about India at all, but about India's sense of responsibility to the world, of which it is such a crucial part, and whose destiny it has earned the right to help shape. I want to rest my case there to take a few questions from you. I thank the organizers for having such an extraordinary conference, and thank you all for giving me such a patient hearing. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much. After all, soft power is not so soft. You know, your comments about the bayonet, that's one thing you can't do with it, is sit on it. Reminds me of what we say in the corporate world. Blessed are you if you sit on a pin, for thou shalt rise again.
Very good. I must use that in politics. I think that's my only discovery.
Even your comments about soft power for nations reminds me of what we say in the corporate world, that to be globally competitive, it's not the tangible assets you have, but the intangible assets you have. And the three intangible assets any globally competitive organization needs to have are the three C's: concepts, competencies, and connections. So there's a lot that nations can learn from companies and companies can learn from nations. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. I already have some. This session was for 45 minutes, but it's not often we get someone like that. So I hope you will agree that we'll extend it by a few minutes and cut short the subsequent tea break by those minutes. Some questions have already come in, so let me
There's some
take
hands
those
being
first.
raised there also.
Yeah, but some have come in. So
I see.
we'll alternate between the questions that have
We've
come in.
been
as
live
well.
and recorded, as it were. Okay.
Can India form an alliance with China instead of accepting the role of a counterweight to China?
Well, actually, it's a very interesting question, because I agree that the counterweight argument is not very good.
And we have a delegation from China here,
Oh, I see. Excellent.
right here at the table on your northeast.
Wonderful. Well, the counterweight argument is not very good because India is far too big to serve anybody else's interests. And China, we have one outstanding problem, the unresolved frontier, which China seems to be in no hurry to settle with us. But certainly in other areas, I see nothing but positive potential. Trade has already gone up 250 times in a generation, from a few tens of millions of dollars in the early 90s to 70 billion today. Yes, the terms of trade have not so far been advantageous, but we are trying to change that. I should stress, of course, that the present government has not only underscored the previous government's message on trade, but it's also opened up more avenues of investment to China, removing some of the security fears that India had expressed in the past about Chinese investment in ports, telecoms, and so on. So now those barriers, the Prime Minister has announced, no longer exist, and we should see China developing more of an interest and more of a stake in India's economy. But where I'm truly surprised we haven't moved together forward is in something like, as I mentioned in my remarks, the importance of keeping open the sea lanes of communication from the Gulf and East Africa across to India and beyond India to China, across the Arabian Sea and through the Straits of Malacca. This is a shared interest. Why are we allowing, frankly, Western strategic analysts to persuade us that India and China must compete in the Indian Ocean and that China is busy constructing a string of pearls to strangle the Indian neck? And so, first of all, our neck is too thick to be easily strangled. But secondly, we actually have the same interest. If the sea lanes of communication to India are interrupted, that happens to be the first half of the journey to China. So China too wants to keep these sea lanes open. We want to keep the sea lanes open. I would offer to conduct joint exercises with China on this, naval exercises and keeping open the sea lanes across the Arabian Sea. And in turn, ask the Chinese to invite us to do the same across the Straits of Malacca. I mean, we have a small, incipient blue water navy. They have a slightly larger one, but basically, we're both growing our navies with the same sort of interest in mind. So I think your questioner is quite right. We can find areas not only of economic, but also geopolitical partnership. It would certainly help if the Chinese showed a little more urgency in settling the land border. They've settled their land border with every other country but us. And if they were to do that, it would remove the hugest area of mistrust and occasional media tension that arise between our countries. And I honestly, the advantage that accrues to China from maintaining this dispute, including the ability to throw India occasionally off balance with a statement by their envoys or by some foreign policy spokesman, that, I think, is vastly outweighed by the gains of a friendly and cooperative relationship with India. So I hope that Beijing too starts rethinking this approach, and we certainly should rethink it.
Thank you. We'll take one from the audience. Yes, the gentleman at the back with the coat.
Thanks, Feroz, for the opportunity. Thanks, Shashi, for an excellent exposition, which of course was expected. My specific question is that whatever you said, the entire content, I tend to feel that the main problem why it has arisen is lack of wisdom in our education system. Now, I fail to understand, I've battled with this for many, many years, why our architects of modern India, when they could visualize the science, the IITs and the IIMs and everything else, why wasn't their vision there on primary education, which is essential for them to be able to land up there? So we built up an aristocratic society. I would like your comments on that. Incidentally, I was 2 years your junior in the University of Delhi.
Oh, okay. Good to see you.
Thank you.
No, I must admit that is, your indictment is partly right, but blaming just the Indian government would be unfair because, unfortunately, that was the legacy that the government inherited. When the British left, our literacy rate in the whole of India was 16%. In fact, when it came to women, it was 8%. So that only 1 out of 12 women in India, 12.5 women in India could actually read and write. So we had a heck of a long way to go. Partly, therefore, because we built on the existing structures and tried to compensate where compensation was required, more emphasis and more expenditure went on higher education. And I would agree with you that it was perhaps a flawed strategy. With hindsight anyway, had we created a solid primary education base in the 50s, we might not be struggling with so much of adult illiteracy today. We're now making up for it. The Right to Education Act of the UPA government may have its flaws, but it's at least got the kids into school. And there was a very confident assertion that something like 97, 98% of all 5-year-olds in India today are in school. So eventually, when they grow up, we will no longer have adult illiterates to worry about. But in fact, that isn't even the entire solution because dropout rates are alarmingly high. Quality is a huge problem. But you know, at the end of class 5, when kids are tested at class 2 levels, only 40%, 45% are matching class 2 levels at the end of class 5. So quality is a huge problem. But the other problem is, of course, that by class 5, people start dropping out in alarming numbers, and it gets worse by the time you get to class 8, and by class 10, it's a minority. By college, we're down to 20%. So we do have a real problem, and you know, I had only a small taste of this with a year and a few months in the Ministry of Education, and that too, not as the number one. So I can't claim to have had any decisive impact on these outcomes, but I've got a good understanding of the issue. I do believe that this could be done differently. Certainly, I don't believe it's being done well by the present government. I think they've got completely the wrong end of the stick. They're too busy trying to saffronize the higher education system and not spending enough attention on primary education and literacy. Very, very sad. Yeah.
Bothers me so much is that if you take care of primary education and wisdom development, all this talk of health and sanitation and your family planning, everything will fall in place. That is where we have to hit in our policy.
I agree with you, and even more than that, I've also argued that education in India is not only a socio-economic issue, and there you're right, but it's also a national security issue. Because, let's not forget we've had Naxalite, Maoist incidents in 165 of our 625 districts. And basically, Maoism and Naxalism and so on are sustained by large numbers of undereducated or uneducated, unemployed young men who essentially have no stake in our society or economy because they have no prospects in it since they never had an education. They're the ones who are prey to the blandishments of somebody offering them 1,000 rupees and a Kalashnikov. So if you allow that number to keep growing and swelling, and right now our demography is such that the population of India is astonishingly young, if you don't catch and train and educate the ones who are young today, tomorrow you're going to have an absolute mess of anarchy and violence on your hands. So it's a national security problem as well, and there I believe we have to give this the single biggest importance. And I don't see it happening with the present government, sadly.
I have some questions here which I'll combine. Can India build soft power by encouraging Indian media and entertainment industry to cater to global audiences?
Well, the fact is
I'll
that...
just combine two more, Shashi, so it may be easier since we're... How can India strengthen its position in a complex, multi-conflict world?
Well, that was what my speech was about, so I'm not sure I should repeat the whole speech.
Can India secure its borders and expand the economy by allowing its neighbors stakes in the economy?
Yes. Okay. So on the first one, I would simply say that our global mass popular culture is not something the government needs to give any direction to. So I'm not in favor of the government of India directing or building or trying to leverage what is basically the product of our popular culture. Bollywood makes movies that they believe will appeal to audiences and be commercially viable. Audiences of NRIs have already become something they're conscious of. Increasingly, if they're good enough, they will appeal to foreign audiences. And I think the quality of the filmmaking, the shooting, the acting, the editing, all that has now essentially become, in many cases, of international standard, which was not true a generation ago. And so increasingly, we are going to develop and maintain more and more international audiences. Let the commercial, let the logic of the market prevail there. I don't think it needs to be directed from above. Where we're not leveraging these things enough is in the areas I mentioned, but we can talk about that separately. Coming to your last question, giving the neighbors a stake in our economy, I'm very much in favor. I have long argued, for example, that we have a seemingly impossible position with Pakistan because our government talks to a government which is either unwilling or unable to control the so-called non-state actors, the jihadis and so on, who are marching to the tune of a different drummer. The ISI is a law unto itself. The Pakistani military has its own foreign policy agenda. And the government, which is all we can talk to, really doesn't control any of this. So many people in government have been despairing about how we can work with the Pakistanis. To which my answer is, let's accept this reality and let's instead develop another area. Let us open up people-to-people contact dramatically in order to widen the space within Pakistani civil society for good relations with India. So if we end up basically doing more and more trade, opening up our markets, more and more influential people in Pakistan are going to develop an interest in seeing peace and prosperity with India because their own economic success will increasingly be dependent on Indian markets. We give them that opportunity, and by the way, many of these companies are run by the military or by retired military. They're part of Pakistan's Army, Inc. And if those people start developing an interest in maintaining uninterrupted commercial flows to India, believe me, the incentive to disrupt those flows by having terrorist attacks on India will diminish dramatically. The only way we're ever going to solve our relationship with Pakistan is by pursuing such an approach, in my personal view. I have argued this without any success so far, but one more audience can also listen to me. So yes, give the Pakistanis a stake in our economy, and give others also a stake in our economy, and Pakistan's where it really matters.
One last question. Yes, sir, go ahead, please. And I'm afraid this will have to be the last one. We've exceeded our time limit by 15 minutes.
Thank you,
with
sir.
the permission of the DG.
I am General Nehra, retired from the Army about a year and a half back, and had the pleasure of serving in the United Nations, sir, when you were the Under Secretary General. I was in Lebanon.
Oh, I see.
My,
Did very well there too.
When the war was, you know pretty well. My question is directed towards our relations with our smaller neighbors. All of us are aware, sir, that as a country, we are very secular. In spite of what people say, we are very democratic. We are also very tolerant. And as you said, we are quite open to cooperative cooperation or development. We were the first responders to the Nepal tragedy, earthquake, and the largest measure. Yet Nepal is leaning away from us. That was not the only instance where Bangladesh story is well known. Sri Lanka, we helped them we went to their rescue at their request, and yet we made more enemies than friends. I'm not talking of Pakistan. You put it very nicely there. And even China is another matter. Even Bhutan, I would say, the relations are not so nice as they appear on the top. So successive governments, I feel, have bungled in handling affairs with the smaller neighbors. What do you say? What is your opinion on this? And is there a way out? I feel there is.
No, I agree entirely, and I would say that one of the problems is something perhaps that no government could have helped, which is our size. You know, we are unfortunately the biggest. We are the sort of, in the American cliche, the 298-pound gorilla on the beach. And when we sit around a table with our neighbors, we alone account for 80% of the GDP and 70% of the population of the whole of South Asia. And that bigness, I mean, frankly, around the world, no small country likes a bigger neighbor. There's that wonderful line about Mexico, or was it Cuba, saying, oh, our poor country, we are so far from God and so close to the United States. You know, I'm sure many would say the same thing about India. You can ask a Bangladeshi or a Sri Lankan, a sentiment like that would appeal to them. So the first problem is we displace so much weight that we, without even intending it, intimidate our neighbors. However, we have been a bit slow to adopt the approach that the UPA did adopt in the last couple of terms, which is that we need a policy of asymmetrical relations, where we accept that because we are so large, we need to give more than we get. In the past, we always acted as if we'll give you this and you give us something equivalent. But for a small country to give the big country the same thing the big country is giving them usually works against the interests of the small country, and that used to breed resentments. We are now accepting, or at least we have accepted, I'm not sure yet that's true of the BJP government, but the UPA government certainly said asymmetrical relations. We will give more than we get because we need to make that gesture. We need to be more magnanimous. We are bigger. There are, however, other problems. If you look at the Nepal earthquake story that you mentioned, what was the thing that really got the backs up of the Nepalese? It was the combination of the Indian media's all-invasive braggadocio and the hyperactive PR machine of the BJP government, which somehow made every story about the Nepalese tragedy a story about India's triumph in solving it. I mean, this meant there was resentment was building up day after day, and finally they said, you please go, we don't want your help. And that became a problem for us. But secondly, the mismanagement of the whole constitutional issue and the Madhesi agitation, partly because this is a very centralized government. Everything is done at the PMO. The MEA was largely out of the loop in taking final decisions on Nepal, and the PMO had too many things to do, so they took their eye off the ball. And the constitution that was adopted in Nepal was adopted before we could intervene to prevent the problems that then inevitably arose. So I would blame the government for mishandling that. Nonetheless, I believe the Nepalese story can be turned around. I mean, the Nepalese know there's no way they can get around the fact that we are there. I mean, they have tried to promote the idea of a Chinese alternative, but geography works against the Chinese ever becoming as close to Nepal as India is, in addition to demography and ethnicity also working in favor of India. So I think we can repair it with India. Bangladesh, we now have a friendly government there. The BJP had opposed the UPA's land boundary agreement. Finally, it came around and supported us. And now we've given the Bangladeshis something that really matters, settling the border. We can build on that. Sri Lanka, it's a bit more complicated dance, but I believe we can make it happen. And certainly, we have a government that is much better disposed to India than the previous government of President Rajapaksa was. In fact, Rajapaksa blames us for his defeat But the people who are in power now want to work with us, and we can develop that. Maldives, another story. I think we were not sufficiently loyal to a pro-Indian president. We should have showed him up rather than letting him be unseated. But once he was, we are working reasonably credibly with the successor government. Pakistan is another story. We've already talked about it briefly. So though the stories around the neighborhood may be, as you put it, largely negative, I'm not a pessimist. I believe we can reconstruct those narratives and make them more positive. And certainly all of us dealing with foreign policy in one way or the other, whether as commentators and writers, whether as MPs, I'm chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee, whether those in the government, we can all collectively work together to push this narrative in the right direction. We should do so. Thank you all very much.
It was a very interesting session. Thank you, Shashi.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for sharing your views with us, and Mr. Vandrawala for conducting this session. May I request you, sir, to kindly present a memento of our appreciation to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. That concludes our first session of the day.